The School That Slept on the Floor. Part 1. The Laundromat. The building had been a laundromat. You could still tell, if you knew what to look for, the ghost marks on the linoleum where the commercial washers had sat in 2 long rows, the plumbing capped in the back wall that had once fed them, the particular quality of flatness in the space, its total indifference to aesthetics, the way a room looks when it was designed entirely around function and the function has departed. The previous tenant had left behind 3 folding chairs, a calendar from 1961, and a smell of industrial detergent so deeply embedded in the walls that it had outlasted the machines by what Chuck calculated was going to be at least a year. He had rented it on the 1st of March 1963, with 3 months' rent paid up front. Money borrowed from Diane's mother with the understanding that he would repay it within 6 months, and the private understanding held between himself and the arithmetic he did in his head on the drive home that 6 months was optimistic. He was 23 years old. He had been discharged from the Air Force 14 months earlier. He had a wife and 2 young sons and a plan that had seemed clearer in the Air Force barracks in Korea than it did standing in an empty former laundromat in Torrance, California, trying to calculate whether he could afford to buy a mirror. He could not afford to buy a mirror. He bought one anyway, on a payment plan from a store on Hawthorne Boulevard, because a dojo without mirrors was a technical obstacle to certain forms of instruction, and also because, he admitted this to himself, only in the way you admit things that you know to be true but that you're not ready to say out loud, he needed the room to look like a dojo, not for his students, of whom there were currently none, for himself. He needed to come through the door and see something that told him what this place was, what it was going to become, because without that visual confirmation, the plan existed only in his head, and plans that exist only in the head are, in his experience, easier to abandon. He installed the mirror himself on a Saturday, with tools borrowed from his neighbor. He painted the walls white because white was the cheapest, and also because white reflected light, and the one window was too small for the room. He swept the linoleum. He put up a small sign on the door, hand-lettered, which said, Norris Tang Su Do, classes beginning March 15. The 15th of March came and went. 3 people showed up. 2 were in their early 20s, curious rather than committed. 1 was a teenager whose mother had dropped him off and waited outside for the hour. Chuck taught all 3 the same material, the first 2 weeks of what he had planned as a 12-week foundational course, with the professionalism he brought to everything and the private awareness that 3 people at $3 per session was $9, and the weekly rent on the space was $35. The math was a problem he was going to solve. Part 2. The Nights. The first night he slept on the floor was the 3rd Thursday of March. He had not planned to. He had driven over after dinner to do some additional work on the equipment he was building, a wall-mounted striking pad assembled from materials he had found at the salvage yard on Western Avenue, which was costing him more time than money, which was the correct trade-off given the relative availability of each. He had been working for 3 hours when he checked his watch, and it was past midnight, and he was tired in the specific way that comes from physical work done at the end of a long day, and the option of lying on the floor for a few hours before driving home was more appealing than the drive itself. He had a sleeping bag in the back of the car. He had it there not because he planned to sleep at the dojo, but because he had been camping with Diane and the boys 2 months earlier and had not yet transferred the camping equipment back to the closet, an act of non-urgency that was now paying a small dividend. He retrieved the sleeping bag and lay on the dojo floor, which was linoleum over concrete and which was cold and hard in the specific way of surfaces that have not been designed for human habitation. He lay on his back and looked at the ceiling, which was the ceiling of a former laundromat, flat, water-stained in one corner, crossed by two fluorescent fixtures he had left on because the one small window admitted no meaningful illumination. He thought about the lease. The 3 months' rent he had paid up front would run out on June 1st. To carry the space past June 1st, he needed to be generating more income than he currently was. He ran the numbers, which he had been running regularly since March 1st, with the same result. The current enrollment of 6 students, the original 3 had stayed and he had added 3 more, produced $18 per week in tuition. The weekly rent was $35. The gap between these two numbers was $17 per week, which was the amount by which the project was failing every 7 days. He had not told Diane the extent of this. He had told her the school was growing slowly, which was true. He had not told her that slowly was still not fast enough to cover the rent, which was also true, and which was the part that kept producing the specific quality of wakefulness at 3 in the morning that he had been managing for 3 weeks. The fluorescent lights hummed. The linoleum was cold against his back. He thought about what he would do if the school failed, if it reached June 1st with the gap still unresolved. If the second 3 months of rent was not available, if the sign came down and the mirror came back on the payment plan, and the former laundromat went back to waiting for its next tenant. He lay with this possibility the way you lie with difficult things, not fighting it, not accepting it, but holding it in the way you hold a thing you're not yet ready to put down and not yet certain you can carry. He fell asleep at approximately 2. He woke at 5:15, stiff in the specific way of the incorrectly rested, and ran through his forms in the empty room in the early grey before the street outside began to carry traffic, and then he drove home and ate breakfast with Diane and the boys and went to his other job, the aircraft parts warehouse on Crenshaw, where he worked 30 hours a week for wages that covered the house payment and approximately nothing else, and did not mention having slept at the dojo. Part 3: The Economics of Belief. By the end of April, he had 11 students. This was progress. 11 students at $3 per session was $33 per week, which was still $2 less than the rent, which meant the gap had narrowed but had not closed. He was also, by April, working 35 hours at the warehouse and teaching 15 hours of classes per week, and spending an additional 8 to 10 hours per week on the administrative and physical maintenance of the school itself. This produced a weekly schedule of approximately 60 working hours, none of which were in the same location, which meant a significant portion of them were also in transit. He was sleeping at the dojo 2 nights per week by the end of April. Not every week. Some weeks he made it home every night, but on the nights when the work at the dojo ran long and the drive home seemed like an expenditure of energy that could be better applied to the 5:15 form session, he stayed. The sleeping bag had been moved inside and was living in the equipment closet, which also held a folding chair, a can of touch-up paint, and a length of rope he had used for an experimental training apparatus that had not worked. Diane knew about the sleeping bag. She did not ask about it directly, which was the Diane method of dealing with things she had decided she was going to support even before she fully understood them. She would ask, eventually, when the numbers changed in one direction or the other, when the situation resolved into something that warranted explicit discussion. Until then, she held the space of not asking with the particular quality that he associated with her, a combination of trust and clear-eyed assessment of what the trust was costing her that she was choosing to extend anyway. He was grateful for this in a way that exceeded his ability to express it at the time, and that he would not find the language for until years later. He added 2 students in the first week of May. Both were 19 years old, both from the neighborhood, both arriving because of something a friend had said about what was happening in the space on the former Laundromat block. The karate school phenomenon was still new enough in California that a school's existence was noteworthy in a local community. People talked about it the way they talked about any new thing that had appeared in the neighborhood, and that required evaluation before adoption. 13 students, $39 per week. The rent was $35. He was, for the first time, $4 ahead of the weekly cost of keeping the door open. He sat in his car in the parking lot after the last class of the Thursday and did the arithmetic and then sat with it for a moment before driving home. $4 ahead, not comfortable, not sustainable through any unexpected expense or enrollment drop. But ahead, which was different from behind in the specific way that matters when you've been behind for 11 weeks. He drove home and told Diane. She made coffee at 10 o'clock at night, which was unusual for her, and they sat at the kitchen table and drank it and talked about the school for an hour. The first full conversation about it that hadn't been conducted under the particular quality of pressure that comes from discussing a deficit. He told her about the students, the ones who were committed and the ones who were tentative. He told her about the wall-mounted pad that he had finally got right. He told her that he thought 2 more students in the next month would move them from survivable to stable, and that stable was a different kind of ground. She looked at him across the kitchen table with the cup in both hands and said, "You're going to make this work." It was not a question. It was not encouragement in the conventional sense. It was not the kind of thing you say to someone who needs their confidence propped. It was a plain statement of something she had observed and concluded, delivered as information. He drove back to the dojo that night and slept on the floor and was at the 5:15 forms session the next morning with the specific quality of energy that comes from knowing you are $4 ahead. Part 4. The landlord. His name was Bernard Kaczynski, and he was 62 years old, and he had owned the building since 1951, when the street had been different and the laundromat had been a reasonable bet on a neighborhood's trajectory. He was not a hard man. He was a practical one, which Chuck had learned was a different category. A hard man doesn't care about your situation. A practical man cares about it exactly as much as it's relevant to whether he is going to get his money. Kaczynski appeared on the afternoon of the last Thursday in May, which was the Thursday before the 1st of June deadline that had been running in Chuck's calculations for 2 months. He came without calling ahead, which was his right as the landlord, and he came in through the front door during the 3:30 intermediate class, which meant that Chuck was in the middle of demonstrating a defensive rotation to 8 students when a 62-year-old man in a sport coat walked in. Chuck finished the demonstration. He asked his most experienced student to lead the group through the sequence 3 times. Then he went to the door. Kaczynski looked around the space with the practiced eye of someone who had seen a lot of spaces and their various states of occupation. He looked at the mirror Chuck had installed, the wall pad, the students, 8 of them, ages ranging from 16 to 35, doing the defensive rotation with varying degrees of precision under the senior student's instruction. "You painted," Kaczynski said. "White," Chuck said. "Covered everything." "The mold in the corner, 2 coats. The ventilation problem is still there, but I fixed the water intrusion." Kaczynski looked at the corner. "You fixed the water intrusion?" "The flashing on the exterior wall was pulling away from the seal. I resealed it. Cost me $6 in material and 4 hours. He paused. "I can show you the receipts if you want. I didn't charge it against the rent." Kaczynski looked at him. Then he looked at the students. "How many you got?" 13 right now. 2 more starting next week. "You live here?" A pause. The specific quality of a pause that is not an evasion, but is also not a direct answer. "Some nights," Chuck said, "when the work runs late." Kaczynski looked at the equipment closet, through whose door the sleeping bag was visible, folded and stored, but visible. He looked back at Chuck. "The June 1st, he said. "I have the money," Chuck said. This was true. He had scraped together 3 months' rent from the accumulated surplus of the preceding 2 months, plus a loan from the warehouse job's advance pay. The money existed. The question of whether the school could sustain itself past September without additional growth was a separate and open question. Kaczynski was quiet for a moment. He looked at the students who were doing the defensive rotation with the systematic patience of people who had been told to repeat something until they were told to stop. He looked at the mirror and the wall pad and the painted walls and the equipment closet door. "I had a grocery store before the laundromat," he said. 1942. "First 2 years I slept in the back room. My wife used to bring me dinner on Tuesdays." He paused. "The month we moved to actually paying rent on an apartment," she cried. "Not because we had the money, because we had done the thing right." He looked at Chuck. "You'll have June 1st. "I know," Chuck said. "September 1st too?" Chuck looked at the class, at the students doing the rotation, at the room he had built from a laundromat over 3 months of early mornings and late nights and floor sleeping and borrowed money and arithmetic that kept resolving wrong and then finally right. "Yes," he said. Kaczynski nodded. He left without further discussion, which was his method, which was the method of a practical man who had gotten what he came for. Part 5. The 16th student. Her name was Miriam Okafor, and she was 38 years old, and she walked in on the second Tuesday in June with the specific quality of someone who has been considering doing something for a long time and has decided to stop considering it. She was not the demographic Chuck had been expecting. His students were mostly young men, teenagers and men in their 20s, the natural market for martial arts in 1963 in a Southern California suburb, drawn by a combination of the competitive aspect and the cultural currency of the practice. Miriam Okafor was none of these things. She was a nurse at the hospital on Torrance Boulevard, 12 years older than Chuck, the mother of 2 daughters in elementary school, and she had seen the hand-lettered sign on the door for 6 weeks before she came in. She told him this when she arrived, that she had been walking past on her way to the bus stop twice a week and had been reading the sign and had been deciding. She said she wanted to learn because she walked home from the late shift 3 nights per week along Hawthorne Boulevard, and she was tired of walking it the way she walked it, which was with the awareness of being alone in a specific way that she was tired of feeling. Chuck showed her the curriculum. She enrolled. What Miriam Okafor brought to the school was not immediately obvious. She was a careful learner, slower than the teenagers, less physically fluent, acquiring each technique with the methodical patience of someone accustomed to learning complex things in high-stakes environments. She asked questions during class that were different from the questions the younger students asked, less about the competitive application of a technique, more about the underlying logic of it, the physics of why it worked, the specific body mechanics that produced its effect. The questions changed the class, not dramatically, not in any way that Chuck could have pointed to in the moment and said, "This is what is changing." But the younger students heard the questions and began to think about them, and the thinking changed the quality of their practice in the direction of understanding rather than imitation. Within 3 weeks, 2 other women had enrolled, both referred by Miriam Okafor, both from her circle of colleagues at the hospital. Total enrollment, 18 students, tuition $54 per week, rent $35 per week, weekly surplus $19. He stopped sleeping at the dojo in July, not because of a decision, because the drive home had ceased to feel like a negotiation and had become simply the end of the working day. Part 6. What the floor taught him. He taught a class on the 3rd Saturday in August with 22 students, the most he had had at any single session, and after the class, while the students were filing out, he sat on the floor of the empty room and did the thing he sometimes did when the school was empty and he wanted to think about something clearly. He looked at the space and tried to see it as an objective observer would see it: the mirror on the west wall, the wall pad, the painted white walls, the students' shoes in a row by the door, which was a practice he had instituted in April and which had the incidental effect of making the space look more occupied than any single shoe's presence would suggest. The particular smell of the room after a class, the bodies, the effort, the cedar chips he had put under the raised section by the equipment closet. He thought about March, about the first night on the floor, the fluorescent lights, the industrial detergent smell, the arithmetic that didn't resolve. He thought about the $6 plumbing repair and the borrowed tools for the mirror installation and the sleeping bag in the closet and Diane's coffee at 10 o'clock at night and Kaczynski's story about the grocery store in 1942. He thought about something that had happened in the intermediate class that morning, which had been the thing that prompted the sitting and the thinking. One of his original 3 students, a young man named David Park, 21 years old, who had been there since March 15th, and who had the particular quality of a person who learns through accumulated repetition rather than sudden insight, who works slowly and arrives surely, had demonstrated a technique with a precision that was genuinely beautiful, not showy, not performed for the benefit of the class, simply correct in a way that showed he understood the technique rather than had learned to execute it, which were different things that looked similar and felt entirely different to anyone who was paying attention. Chuck had watched this and felt something he did not have a precise word for, a feeling adjacent to pride, but not pride exactly, because pride implies ownership, and he had not made David Park competent. David Park had made David Park competent through the specific process of showing up and doing the work over and over until it resolved into understanding. What Chuck felt was something more like recognition, the recognition of a process working. The recognition that the room was doing the thing a room of this kind was supposed to do. He sat on the floor and thought about this for a while, and arrived at something that he had been approaching from the outside for several months, and that now presented itself from the inside with the clarity of a thing that has been ready to be understood for longer than you have been ready to understand it. The school was not the dojo or the lease or the enrollment numbers or the arithmetic that ran to surplus or deficit. The school was the room where David Park's technique had become beautiful over 23 weeks of showing up. The school was the question Miriam Okafor had asked in class last Tuesday about the physics of the weight transfer. The school was the 16-year-old who had shown up the first week, barely able to do a proper stance, and who was now teaching the early students how to hold theirs. These things were happening because he had kept the door open through the months when keeping it open made no financial sense. Not because of optimism. Optimism was a luxury he had not been able to afford in March, because of the specific quality of commitment that does not negotiate with its own conditions. He had decided the school would exist. He had slept on the floor to honor that decision. The floor had held him, and the room had done its work, and the school existed. He understood something now that he had not understood when he painted the walls in March. The floor was not a failure condition. The floor was the commitment made physical. Every night he had spent horizontal on linoleum was a night he had decided that this was worth doing, that the gap between income and rent was a temporary condition rather than a verdict. The school that was now sustaining itself had been built on those decisions, one at a time, in the dark, with the fluorescent lights humming. Log the expansion. In Themensron 63, Chuck Norris signed a new lease with Bernard Kaczynski for another 6 months. In October, he hired his first assistant instructor, a former Air Force contact named Ray Medina, who had trained briefly under the same Tang Soo-do school in Korea and who was looking for part-time work, and who took over the Tuesday evening beginner class, freeing Chuck to add a Saturday advanced session. Enrollment reached 25 by November. He stopped working at the aircraft parts warehouse at the end of the year. The school's income, combined with the growing competition winnings he had begun to accumulate, he had entered his first tournament in November and, despite losing, had collected enough in participation fees from the dojo's name recognition to offset the entry cost, was sufficient to sustain the household without the second job. He called Diane's mother and repaid the borrowed rent in full with a handwritten note that said thank you and nothing else, because thank you was the complete truth of it. In March of 1964, exactly 1 year after the sign went up on the former laundromat, Chuck Norris counted his students and arrived at 31. He stood in the middle of the floor of the room that had been a laundromat and was now something else, that had the specific texture of a place that had been given a purpose through the accumulated weight of presence, through the mornings and the nights and the floor and the arithmetic and the mirror and the 16-year-old who could now teach the stance. And he stood in the middle of it and felt the full weight of what a year of not closing the door had produced. 31 students in a room that had once held washers. He had slept on the floor to get here. The floor had been worth sleeping on. He would sleep on it again in the years ahead when he opened the second school and the third, and the doors that had to be held open by presence rather than logic. He knew this now. He knew that the school that mattered was always the school you kept open past the point where keeping it open made easy sense. That was the only school worth having. He went home for dinner. The floor held the room's warmth for another hour after he left, the linoleum retaining it the way all floors do, holding what has been given to them, returning it slowly, patient with the dark.